Well, we're so happy that you are joining us again on this Sabbath. It's a pause that you can take, a moment that you can utilize in order to open Scripture and find and redefine what God has for you today. We've got an exciting conversation. We're going to grapple with some themes and texts in the Bible. But before that, like we do every Saturday, take a look at this wonderful Mission Spotlight.
Leilani took a year from studying at her university to become a student missionary. She knew she wanted to serve overseas, but didn't know where God wanted her to go.
I was just looking for a position I could teach English in a country that I had never heard of. So I prayed to God, asked Him to give me a place I had never been to, and now I'm here and it's the best decision I've ever made.
Leilani was nervous when her plane touched down in Albania, but now, just 1 month later, she's discovering both the joys and challenges of being an Adventist volunteer. She's volunteering at this kindergarten, which is run by the humanitarian organization ADRA Albania in cooperation with local church leaders. The school was started with the belief that investing in the community's education will create happy, healthy children and families, contributing to a stronger society.
I'm the kindergarten ESL teacher. I teach 3 classes and all of them are in English.
Her classroom is bursting with energy as the kids engage in fun activities. Being a volunteer is not always simple or easy. Leilani has had to adapt to a new language and culture. When she arrived, she couldn't speak Albanian.
And then I come here and I don't understand anything and everybody's translating for me.
Another challenge is being so far from her family and friends in the United States. But the loneliest times have only reinforced her trust in God.
My spiritual life has definitely become stronger just being here for a month. I didn't even expect it. God is there every single day. I came here and my first day here, I was just like, what am I doing here? But through this whole process, you can see God. And so just being here, I'm just like, whoa, you do have me. You do take care of me. And it just shocked me and it's pretty cool. It's actually really cool to know somebody's watching out for you.
Please pray for Adventist volunteers like Leilani, who have accepted God's call to serve. You too can visit AdventistVolunteers.org to see a list of current volunteer opportunities. Thank you for supporting the Seventh-day Adventist Church's work around the world.
Well, that's amazing. I've always dreamt about settling in the Mediterranean and finding out that language goes far and above, beyond our idiosyncrasies, the way that we're connected through service with each other. Now, I've got to be honest. Just this week, I had an interesting conversation with my 3-year-old boy. Now, I know that your life has changed quite a bit as you've dealt with a new lexicon, a new language that you've had to learn rather abruptly. Notions that before seemed foreign to you, ideas like stay-at-home orders and social distancing, the ability to read each other's facial expressions with only the wink and the glimmer of an eye. That's the reality that we now inhabit. And so in this new and interesting time, my 3-year-old approached me. He tugged me as we were getting ready to set up the Christmas tree, and he said, "Dad, is Santa Claus coming this year? Linda and I have decided that the world has so much angst and ache that we want to indulge him in his childlike fantasies. So I looked down and I said, Kai, why would you ask that? Again, he looked up and he said, Daddy, stay at home. Santa can't work. And so then I began to think. I began to think about what this whole season of life has done for me, for my kids, for you at home, for our colleagues here at church, for our own faith community. How the ideas and the borders that we have between our personal life and work, the sections and spaces that we inhabit between the office and the home, those have all dissipated. They've all disappeared. And today, as we begin to close the lesson for this quarter, we look at the relationship that plays out between work and our notions about ministry and ministering to others. Our ideas of education, not just as a series of beliefs or ideas or even skills that you might learn in order to perform a job better, but work and education seen in the context of mission. In order to do that, permit me to tell you a brief story. In 1904, the brilliant German sociologist Max Weber emerged from a mental health crisis. Weber had a discussion with his parents, particularly his overbearing father. He had requested that the father, abusive as he was, leave the home. Sadly, Weber and his father would never get an opportunity to reconcile, as this was the last time they would speak, for the older man would perish but a few days later. This caused in Weber's heart deep feelings of guilt, shame, anxiety, and fear. And all of these feelings coalesced together to bring a mental break. Weber was admitted in a sanitarium. And as he wrestled with insomnia and anxiety, as he dealt with questions about his own morality and his belief system, he began to ponder. He began to ponder what for us humans remains as our greatest fear. And Weber quickly discovered that the fears that cannot be allayed by fantasies, childlike or otherwise, are fears that pertain to ourselves, to the way we see each other. You see, the greatest fear that we have is that we're not good enough. That in the end, when it's all stripped away, we are amoral beings, dangerous. And that if left to our own devices, destruction and desolation will always follow. Now, the reality is, while there is some good evidence to buttress that belief, it cannot be as simplistic as that. Now, the Puritans that settled America did so with that fear as their guiding force. And as Weber was grappling with these notions, he began to ask himself the question of how our fears, these innate fears about not being good enough, play with our approach to work. Now, you and I come from a faith tradition that values Sabbath above all. The idea of rest, the idea of a break in the midst of the week, the idea that human beings were not created to be merely beasts of burdens, but were also made to have a relationship with God. Sabbath, as Abraham Joshua Heschel mentions, God's temple in time, stands at the very fulcrum of Adventist theology. But the reality is that the concept of Sabbath means nothing if it isn't accompanied by this idea of work. Think about the commandment that God delivers to Moses all the way back in Exodus chapter 20. Moses will hear the words, 6 days you shall do all your labor. Well, the Sabbath day loses all meaning without labor, and so Weber, recognizing that and grappling with the fear of not being good enough, begins to ask the question that pertains to our discussion today. How does work play into our religious life? As Weber was beginning to look at different societies, primarily Christian societies, he discovered that there is something interesting about what we fear and the role that work plays in allaying such fears. Weber coined the word in his magnum opus, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, a book that emerges from his deep-seated desire to find peace. Weber notes that in Protestant countries, the idea of work is important. It is the driving force behind, at least in his mind, the Industrial Revolution. And it is the reason why Protestant countries seem to be wealthier and more developed than non-Protestant countries. Well, why is that? How does this idea of work and faith interplay with each other? Well, Weber would say that for Protestants, for heirs of this theological legacy that comes from people like John Calvin, wealth was not seen as a crutch. Rather, it was seen as a blessing from God, a way to ensure that you indeed were good enough to receive God's gifts and mercies. If then you are belonging to a theological tradition that seeks to believe that God's blessings can be manifested in the realm of concrete wealth, then you have an extremely high drive to be successful. And so Weber says that it is out of this Protestant angst that our obsession with work follows. Up to that point, poverty was seen as a gift. Think about the story that Jesus relays in Luke chapter 16, beginning with verse 19. It's the story of Lazarus and the rich man. This rich man, who church tradition has gifted the name Divus. And Lazarus and him enter into this relationship. You know the story well. As they are seeking to find some meaning, something that will connect them, they are ever divided by this existential gulf expressed in the parable by a gate. A gate that Lazarus is unable to climb through and Divus is unable to or unwilling to open. The promise then in the heart of early Christendom before Weber was that if one accepted poverty, then one would be gifted rewards in the afterlife. Well, our friend Max changed all of this and gave a new idea, a new understanding to our concepts of work. But the problem is when work is merely seen as a tool to imagine and idealize the relationship that we have with God. In other words, if God's blessing to you is measured in the way that your work is blessed, then we've got a problem. We've got a problem that has materialized in our lives in a very practical matter today. As people begin to file record unemployment benefit assistance, as they begin to grapple with issues of scarcity in work, as businesses shudder, and as the whole economy quakes and quivers with this pandemic, the ideas that are simplified in Weber's sociological approach to work and faith seem to fail. Now, I'm not here to try and continue following the line of the old church fathers. You know, the ones that commanded the poor to stay poor. Ideas that have harvested pain and suffering in the developing world, as the oppressed are called to remain oppressed because that's God's will. I'm not also interested in continuing Weber's analysis of the link between faith and work. I'd like to propose a new way, a different way of looking at our work. It's a way that appears in Scripture, in that one of my favorite books. It's the book about the sermon, the book written by the preacher, the book that attempts to take all the wisdom that is prevalent in Israelite and Jewish literature and give some practical applications to those tales long cherished. I'm referring, of course, to the book of Ecclesiastes. Now look at what the preacher says in chapter 9. He writes, "Enjoy life with your wife, whom you love all the days of this meaningless life that God has gifted you under the sun. All your meaningless days, for this is your lot in life, and in your toilsome labor under the sun." So what is the preacher trying to tell us? Well, first and foremost, he is trying to dissuade us from the temptation of believing that our identity is linked to what we do. You might be a physician, a lawyer, a merchant, a chief, but the reality is that what you do doesn't define who you are. If you are looking at your job to provide meaning to your life, then your life will remain, as the preacher says, meaningless. Because meaning and identity is not found in what you do, it's found in who you do it with. The call to live life together, to live life connected to one another, to enmesh our stories, and to share in the toil and labor of life on this earth as one. Perhaps that's why Genesis chapter 3 presents the story of the garden and links it with the concept of work. Now, you know the tale well. God places the man in the garden, and he places him in the garden with a directive, namely, go and toil the field. The idea that work is something that follows the fall is not biblical. The text is clear. Adam is commanded to go out and work. But his work provides him pleasure. And as he is thinking about his work indicates something to him. Namely, that something is missing. As Adam is tilling and toiling the land, as he is exercising stewardship over the created order, he recognizes that he is alone. That in him there is a hole that no amount of toil and labor will fill. And thus God creates Eve. And Adam and Eve then are invited to work together in mutually beneficial relationships that will provide meaning and the context, the relational framework, if you will, for their life as a couple. So work matters. But it doesn't matter in the sense of giving you identity. It matters in the sense of giving you something to do with those whom you love. My wife and I believe that the call to ministry is a call that we've shared. Ever since my first parish, Linda and I have approached this job as a sacred invitation from God for us to be involved in the work of kingdom making. And that just doesn't apply to pastors, friends, to doctors, lawyers, students, teachers, whatever field you are called to work in. Make your family, make your partner part of it. But the preacher isn't there yet. He's not done with us. For he continues to write, "Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. For in the realm of the dead where you are going, there is neither working nor planning, nor knowledge or wisdom. Whatever comes to your hand, practice excellence." Again, I think about the story in Genesis, particularly that story that anthropomorphizes God, that places him in a garden as a divine craftsman. How he lovingly sketches Adam's contours out of the dirt. How he then leans over and kisses him in the mouth and blows the breath of life into his lungs. How he sees the man of clay become a living being. And how then he looks at all the works his hands had done and declares them good and very good. We are called to participate in work with our communities, with our circles. But we are also called to employ excellence in all we do. The sad tragedy of sin isn't that we were forced to work, but rather that our work was going to be marred by thorns and thistles. The reality is our work sometimes doesn't yield the results that we would wish. Sometimes the pink slip or the crash in the market stock, sometimes the patient perishing mars our sense of purpose and work. But the reality is, regardless, God has called us to employ excellence, to employ excellence in the context of community, to employ excellence in the context of connectedness. So, the invitation then isn't for you to embrace poverty as one would do in a monastic order. The invitation for you is to open the gate like Divas should in Luke chapter 16. The invitation is to employ excellence in your relationships. The invitation is to engage yourself in the most important work of them all, the enterprise of kingdom making. But the invitation is also not to be so hard on yourself. Thorns and thistles will come. Pain and privation will occur. Sometimes things will not go as you would hope in your job. That doesn't mean that God isn't blessing you. You know, Weber isn't completely right. God's mercies upon us come regardless of the outcomes that we have. So work together and work in excellence. And maybe someday, if we do this well enough, we can turn around and say, my life had meaning. Friends, I am so excited because we get to have a conversation with a colleague of mine, Pastor Joey O., who is our pastor for administration here at Loma Linda University and has a keen mind for all things theology and all things practice, is going to join us for the next few weeks as we discuss the practical implications of the lesson. So Joey, I am excited to have this conversation with you on the idea of work and how it pertains to our ministry.
Hey, Miguel, so excited to be here. Wow. Man, I never thought about how our Protestant theology impacts the way that we approach work. And your statistic about how Protestant countries tend to be richer, more wealthy, never thought about that. How do you think that impacts our relationship with God when we view wealth and as a blessing from God and almost like a metric for the way that God views us?
Yeah, Joey. So that's I think one of the challenges that we have, because when we see these Protestant countries that hold out the banner of Christendom or call themselves Christian nations, they do so, and at the same time they employ some really predatory approaches to the least of these. And so I think what Weber failed to realize is that markets left unchecked, to use Adam Smith's idea of work and the Protestant ethics, to leave these markets unchecked, or to believe that it's only your financial wealth that relates to how God is blessing you, creates a really myopic way of relating to God. And ultimately, what ends up happening, sadly, is you see the relationship that you have with God as a me and God thing. When, if we look at Scripture, the approach that God has for us is a we and him thing. And so it's always the idea of working in the context of community, that our work actually has meaning and value. So I think that's one of the things that in the West particularly we need to work on, this idea of replacing rugged individualism and the pursuit of the American dream, with this idea of care and compassion, not only for me and mine, but for those of us who have less than I do.
Yeah. That reminds me of the quote in the lesson from Ellen White's Education, that love, the basis of creation and of redemption, is the basis of true education. Um, it just talks about how love really is the foundation of all that we do, and if that's true, then love should be the foundation of our work as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Joey, I know that we sometimes struggle with this concept of, particularly in the West, where being busy is seen as a commodity, right? We look at our calendars, or we pull out our phones and we say, "Oh my goodness, I am so busy." Do you think that we can find a balance between being busy and employing this, which I think is such an important concept, the idea of loving, and love, breathing into our, not only our work but our relationships, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, it sort of depends on how we view work. And I loved how you conceptualized it, because even when I think about work being motivated by love, I think of work as for somebody or for something. But you really described it as love with, not just for, but with. When in the conversation about your relationship with your wife and how you both relate to ministry together, you talked about the importance of doing this work as a ministry together. Maybe that's part of how we match the busyness with actually being able to show love in our work, is that even in the way that we perform the work, like, love is a part of it, right?
Oh man, I love that concept. The idea of working with, and just as you were speaking, I my mind goes to ministry, and you're a pastor, and you've been a pastor for a while. You've been at several different churches, and so that ministry, particularly in other churches where we don't have the blessing of having a large staff like we do here at Loma Linda, ministry can be a very lonely enterprise, and I assume that that's true for other areas of work where these places seem like really lonely enterprises. How do you remain intentional, at least in your mind? How do we remain intentional in inviting people to participate in these journeys of our work, which is so important to us?
Miguel, that was the question I was going to ask you.
See, I knew that, and that's why I asked it first, because I don't have an answer to that.
Yeah, that's a good question, especially in pastoral ministry, which is often a very solitary ministry. I mean, we do it for people, we do it in service of God and people, but many times it's a lonely work. I think I think part of it is inviting others, like you said, very intentionally into it. Our loved ones, our family, are people that we can invite in, but also to serve alongside other people. Just heard during our staff worship today about how one of our pastors modeled this or did this just this morning in the prayer meetings that the pastors take turns hosting. Pastor Joelle actually invited, instead of just sharing a devotion herself, she invited a few junior high students to share their testimonies during that time. And so things like that, that's an opportunity for us to work with rather than just for people, right?
That's powerful. That's powerful. I think it's so important because we've been talking this whole quarter about the idea of education and Christian education. And I remember for my parents, the idea was clear, right? I was going to go to college and I was going to get a degree in something related to health sciences. And then I was going to come to Loma Linda and study and go to medical school. And then I was going to have a practice. And I made it to Loma Linda, just not at the medical center. And so often we just reminiscing on that journey, I think to myself that we often see the purpose of education as preparation to do a work and we define work not as a life calling, but as some specialized activity that I then perform. And the thing that ends up happening so often in our lives, busy as they are, is we derive so much identity from our work. And so it's all this being, our very sense of being that comes from the performance of this specialized uh, activity that is often very repetitive. And I find Barna just conducted a study a few years ago about pastors and other professionals and their satisfaction with work. And they noted that in the West, particularly, job satisfaction has been plummeting over the past 2 decades. It's just if people aren't getting the same sense of fulfillment from their work. Now, you and I are pretty close in age. We won't share how old we are. Um, but do you find that in people that are our age and younger, so Generation X, millennials, work is means something different? And if so, what is this different thing that you see work meaning?
That's a good question. You know, I do think that work is directly tied to a sense of identity. Although there has been a push, I think, in the younger generations to actually pursue your passion, and your passion may not be the job that you do, right? The job that you do may be just the side thing where your passion really, it just gives you the money to actually fuel your passion. And that's why you see people like traveling. They'll build out a car and they'll live in their car for a year or two and just travel. And that's their passion. And they'll just do their work on the side just to earn enough money to survive. However, all of those things seems to connect, whether it's the passion or the actual job that you're doing, there is still a sense of it's about me, right? That my work, my passion is all about my fulfillment, my needs, my wants, my skills. And yet, you pointed out something very interesting in that when Adam was first given work, he wasn't given work for his own needs or wants, right? His work actually, like you were talking about, which I thought was incredible, led him to realize what was missing in his life, which was someone to work with and to work for, right? Which was Eve. And even when he was given dominion over the animals, his service was for the world rather than just for his own needs, to serve his own needs. And so, how do you reconcile that biblical concept that work is not really about me with the popular concept that's out there that really what I should be pursuing is my passion and what I want to do, even if that connects with something that's good for the world or for the people around me.
Wow, well, you've just, I think, hit it on the head. You've uncovered, I think, one of the real tensions in our society, because I think you're absolutely right. When we look at work and our passions, and even that which drives us towards Christian education, which is we want this information that hopefully we can employ and leverage later on. We find that when it's centered towards achieving my goals, ultimately dissatisfaction follows. Now, I don't know how scientific this particular study is, but a friend of mine who works in behavioral health mentioned that antidepressants by themselves work to ameliorate symptoms about 30% of the time in about 66% of cases. Now, don't quote me on that. The stats might be a bit off. But what he was mentioning, which I found so interesting, was that there was something that one could do in addition to antidepressants and talk therapy and et cetera, when one was feeling these deep, deep feelings of dissatisfaction, and that is go serve someone else. He was mentioning that when you, as someone that is experiencing deep-seated dissatisfaction in your life, look and focus outward, all the other things seem to work better. And so your outcomes jump, I think, from 66% to 90 some percent, he was talking about. And I think that uncovers a bit about what you're saying. Abraham Joshua Heschel, again, who's one of my favorite writers, talks about this reality that human beings cannot be just created to be beasts of burden. When you look at the Sabbath merely as rest because you're a beast of burden, then you're missing the gift. Human beings were created to establish these deep-seated relational connections. And the Sabbath is the celebration of these connections that you've had during the week. And so I love the fact that you're pushing us to think outwardly and to think about passion, education, and work not centered on me, but centered on we.
Yeah, it was actually something that I read in the book, The Innovative Church by Scott Kermode. He wrote that my purpose derives from my people and not from my passions or my plans. Your calling is not about you. It will require you to become who your people need you to be. And it's been challenging for me to read that because I've often thought of my passions and my plans as really driving my work, right? Like, what has God created me to do? What has He placed in me? And not really considering what are the needs out there? What are the needs of the people that God has called me to serve? And how can I serve those needs? It's been a reframe in my mind, which I'm not sure I completely agree with yet, but it's definitely been challenging me. Yeah.
Wow. Wow. I love that concept that people determine who you ought to be, because it puts us, I think, so much more in line with practicing incarnational ministry. And again, you and I are pastors, but this can be applied, I think, to any other profession. The desire to be incarnational, and the desire to know what people need and then how you can fulfill those needs. I was really blessed by having an opportunity, Joey, when I was new here, to go and do rounds with Will Alexander and some of the residents that were walking in the hospital. And what struck me the most was these people that are now residents in medical school are obviously highly motivated, highly driven, highly intelligent women and men. And yet, Will would always ask them to pause and focus much more on asking questions about the patient. And Will realized that the Loma Linda way is incarnational. We find out what the patient needs, and then we provide care based on those needs rather than, on a diagnostic book. And so just hearing you quote Cormode really, really puts flesh on that concept of practicing our work incarnationally and doing so in community.
Wow. Actually, this concept has become really popular in business circles right now, with something called human-centered design, right? This idea that the people that we are trying to serve, or even if you're thinking in the business model, the people who we are trying to sell to determine what products we should create. They say that a lot of businesses are out there with our solutions looking for a problem, right? They've created a solution that they think people need, and they're trying to find people that need that solution rather than working the reverse, which is finding out what are the problems out there, and then how can I create solutions to fill those problems. And like you said, that's nothing new. That's Jesus's model. He actually came down here to live among us. I mean, you think of the many different ways that he could have saved humanity. He didn't have to live the 30 some odd years down here in order to die, right? He could have come down as an adult and just died on our behalf, and that was it. And yet he chose. There was something about salvation that it was so important that he live here and work here. That was something that the Sabbath School lesson that just kind of opened my eyes, that Jesus spent years of his life being a carpenter. Did he have nothing else better to do as the God of the universe than to be the carpenter? But that's what he did. He lived among us, which I think is so powerful.
Now, I don't know if you've done any carpentry work, because I was thinking about this concept as I was studying, and it just my grandfather was a carpenter. He was a master cabinet maker, and so when he passed away, I inherited several of his tools, and I haven't been able to make a go of it because I just remember him being so detailed, so excellence oriented. And I can just picture Jesus working on a chair or a table or a bed and just being excellence driven and excellence oriented. So, how do you resolve? I don't know. As I was reading and thinking about this lesson, kind of this tension began to rise in me, and I almost got a bit of just existential angst, because on the one hand, as a proud Protestant, I am fully engulfed and enamored with this idea of grace, that we're broken, sometimes irreparably, and God is the one who works in us and through us. But then on the other hand, you have this drive towards excellence that I think comes pretty innate to most human beings. And I'm still trying to see how those two competing, or at least at first glance competing ideas meld with each other. Do you have any wisdom, any words? What are your thoughts on there? I'm sure you saw it as you were looking at the lesson for today as well.
Yeah, that's a good question. I had the same question about that. I, what helped me a lot was actually something that you said, that this idea that if we model work, if we see work not as something that creates our identity, not something that we do for ourselves, but as something that we do with people and we do for other people, then that excellence is not so much a way to make ourselves feel better or to even merit our worth to God, but just it's sprung out of love, right? It's an excellence of showing love to people. And that's what drives our desire for excellence, is not to prove that we're worthy of God's love, but to show love, excellence in the way that we love other people. And that's a very different approach. And it can look the same from the outside, but what's happening in the inside is completely different.
Yeah, and again, that is really helpful resolving the tension a little bit. I remember being in one of my first classes, undergraduate classes in New Testament, and we were tasked with preparing a sermon. And the sermon, there were several pericopes or passages that you could pick, and the one that was allotted to me was Matthew 5:43 through 48. And this is the famous passage where Jesus begins to build this crescendo, and it's the Sermon on the Mount, and he's getting ready for the offering call, and it's just so moving. And he says, "Be therefore perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect." And you're floored by the words, because you say, well, the bar is set so high, it's impossible for me to achieve it. And so I can't remember the content of the sermon. I remember how angst ridden I was about that particular concept. And then I stumbled, I think, upon what you're talking about, which is, hey, you don't pursue excellence as perfection, as perfection or as perfecting a task. That's not the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is always people. And if you practice perfect, mature, kind, caring, considerate, and compassionate love towards people, then the pursuit of the practice will yield excellence, even though it doesn't yield perfection. And so that idea of framing it in the arena of human relationships was very helpful and continues to be very helpful to me until you realize how messy the realm of human relationships is. And so God, it seems, is asking us to embroil ourselves in messiness.
Yeah, messiness. The longer I live, the more I realize how messy life is. And and that's the challenge with all of this. Showing love and motivation is a lot of it happens internally, right? Even in the way of showing love, being motivated in showing excellent love. If I do this, if I care for my wife and I, buy her flowers every day, or take her out to dinner, or help make her feel special, and I'm motivated because I love her I just want her to feel special. That's a way of showing excellent love. But if I'm motivated by, well, I want to look like a good husband. I want my wife to post pictures of me doing this on Instagram so that other people will look at it and say, "Oh, Joey, he's a really good husband." That's a completely different motivation. They're the same actions, but different motivations. And if we're being honest, if I'm being honest, confession time, there's probably a little bit of both mingled in there, right? There's a little bit of motivation of both that sort of kind of seeps into it. And so it's actually being willing to examine my deep motivations and say, what is really driving me to do this? Why am I doing this? And being honest about that, I think, is a first step to moving toward excellent love rather than just trying to do excellence to look good.
Yeah. Well, by the way, I saw Sarah this weekend, and she assures me that you are a wonderful husband. So for our viewers out there, Pastor Joey is a wonderful husband. But I think you've just uncovered again something that is so powerful and so important, which is the idea of motivation. Jean-Paul Sartre, who's a French philosopher slash psychologist slash existentialist, actually makes the argument that there doesn't exist a completely selfless act. We as human beings will never be motivated by something that is completely selfless. Now, Sartre was obviously very cynic about human nature. Nonetheless, that's his argument. But I think we need to be, as you said, we need to be honest with ourselves and say, okay, well, what's driving the motivation for this particular action? Now, you were mentioning love and relationships, and I think that absolutely needs to happen. But as we kind of begin to turn and return full circle to our conversation today, which is about work, I think the question needs to be asked about what is driving me to perform this work. I knew that my family wanted me to be a physician. And I knew that I was not physician material, primarily because my first anatomy and physiology lab, I wanted to vomit. And so I knew that it wasn't my gift set. But I was motivated because of the recognition and the salary and so many other things. And I pursued and I spent and wasted so much time pursuing this dream because I had the wrong motivations. I think ultimately, the question needs to be asked of as we perform whatever work God has called us to perform, what is motivating this work, and how can I be honest and open with myself as I am analyzing these motivations.
Yeah, so my question then to you, Miguel, would be, how does one do that? How do we begin to analyze our motivations? And if we find that the motivations are not what we wish they would be? Does that mean that we need to change our work? Does it mean, what does that mean? Do we have to find a different motivation there? How do we do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for throwing the difficult one at last. But that's a really good question because that's ultimately how we put some practical applications to our conversation. I had a professor once in graduate school. I was doing a seminar at Claremont, and he asked a question that I'd never thought about before. He said, "Well, would you continue believing the things that you believe if you find out that there is no afterlife? So there's no payoff in the end. Um, would you continue to believe in the same things that you believe?" And I thought that was such a nuanced question because it was getting to the heart of motivation. Are you driven by this goal or by achieving something? Or is there something innate and inherent in this belief system that you have that speaks to you and gives your life meaning? And so I think when asking the question about work and what motivates me, I think the same question ought to be asked. If today they were to tell me that all the prestige and the power and the financial flexibility from a job disappears, would I still be willing to do that job? And I
Wow.
think for us, that begins to show us the motivation. So if tomorrow, Joey, in our case as pastors, if the conference loses all funding and Loma Linda ceases to be, and we have these 7 churches in a district somewhere, would we continue to do ministry? And I know this is why, friends, I am so blessed to work on this staff because I know if to a person, the pastoral staff would say, yes, we would continue following that call. But I think that's a good first step.
Wow, that's really powerful. Just strip it of all the other motivations and say, would I still be willing to do this? Wow. Man, that is very challenging. Do you think do you think it's okay for people to want to do a job because of the side motivations at all? Like if to get money to, to for the prestige, is that all right? Should we be driven in all that we do by deeper motivations?
Yeah. So Stu and I have had this conversation several times, and I always tell him that I want to move away from the space of saying these things are okay and these things are not okay. Um, I think it's valid. I think you were mentioning people that say, I'm just going to do this job because it's going to feed my passion. I think that's valid. I have friends. I don't know. You certainly know about people that live in their vans and travel, and then they'll work for 2 months, and they're happy and content. And I think there is meaning and validity to that. Um, so yes, I think pursuing a particular job because it gives you financial security, or it gives you some dose of prestige, I think is valid. Where I think we get into trouble is where we say that job, that financial flexibility or prestige, that is what gives my life meaning. That is the primary driving force for meaning in my life. When we do that, I think that's when we get in trouble.
So where should that sense of meaning and identity come from instead? If it doesn't come from work, which like you were making the point in Protestant countries in the United States, our sense of identity is deeply tied to our work. Where should it come from instead?
In the East, they would say it comes from the community. So people that have a more Eastern background, and we ought to remember the Bible itself is a book written by people that have that mindset. They believe that they're communities of memory. And so the call is always deeper. It is to continue partaking and telling a story. And what my calling in life, as whatever I'm doing, whether that be healthcare or teaching or service industry or whatever I'm doing, my primary role is to do that in order to further this communal history that we have. I think that would serve us well as Christians. We are part of and Adventists particularly, Joey, we have this communal history, and we have this meta-narrative that we call the Great Controversy. The question then is, how does my work continue furthering that narrative? And that's, I think, a question that our friends out there will have to ask and answer.
Wow, that's beautiful. That my work is bigger than me, that my work is a part of something, and I am a part of a tradition that is larger than just my life. Wow.
That's a beautiful way to state it. And that, I think, Joey, is the perfect way to close. We want to thank you so much for joining us. We ask that you continue opening the Bible, that you continue wrestling with Scripture, that you continue studying diligently until we see you next time. Joey, would you like to close us in prayer?
Yes. Dear Heavenly Father, we want to thank you so much for being a God who loves. At the core of who you are, the Bible is clear, is that you are a God of love. And the work that you do, the constant work that you do, is driven out of that love. And so you call us to join into this joy of communal work, communal love, communal work with and for the larger community of the universe and of this world, Lord. And so help us to join this everlasting dance of work with you is our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. May God bless you richly.